In this video, we're going to look at how you can dynamically change submix send levels and submix output volumes and the settings within submix effects. In the demonstration level at shortcut key 5, which is near the waterfall and cave entrance area, we're going to go over here to the right. Roaming around this area is a will-o'-the-wisp, a devilish entity from folklore. When the wisp gets nearer the player, we want to use some effects to create a weird and uneasy feeling. We're going to start with the wisp's own sound, which is that of fire, and when its outer sphere overlaps with the player, we want to apply some reverb to that sound. We'll start by creating a submix effect for the reverb. So in our audio, submixes and effects folder, right click, sounds, effects, submix effect preset. We'll call this wisp fire reverb. I'm just going to edit that and paste in some settings that I have pre-prepared. Next, we'll assign that to a submix that I'm going to call wisp fire. So we'll edit the submix, add a submix effects chain, and find our wisp fire. And finally, we'll edit the sound itself and we'll send it to that submix. Now the trick here is to keep the send level initially at 0, so the file will not have any reverb applied to it. And what we'll do is we'll dynamically change that send level within blueprints. So let's open up our will-o'-the-wisp blueprint. Now in this area here, what we're calling the sound bubble is where the sphere collision component detects the overlaps and end overlaps. So when the collision sphere is overlapped by the player, we want to turn that send level up, and when we end overlap, we want to turn that send level down. So we'll move over here and we'll get a reference to our fire sound component. And we can just drag out of that and set submix send. The thing to remember here is that although the submix is assigned to the sound already, you'll still need to make reference to the correct submix, in this case wisp fire, in this node, since the sound may be going to several submixes. So let's set that send level to 0.8, and when we come out of the collision sphere, let's create another copy of that, and we'll set that back to 0. The wisp normally roams around this area, but for the moment I've set the moving condition to false. So we'll play the game. And just on the periphery, you should be able to hear that fire with no reverb applied. I'm just going to solo that sound so we can hear it a bit more clearly. And as we collide with that sphere collision component, the send level is going to change. So we now have that reverb being applied because 0.8 of that signal is being sent to that submix, and then as we come out again, the send level returns to 0. Now in this case we changed the submix send level on an audio component, but if we wanted instead to apply effects to other sounds in the environment, for example ambient sound actors, we could create a variable of type ambient sound actor and then make this public in order to pick an actor in the level. I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it crickets. I'm going to set its type to be ambient sound actor. I'm going to make it public. So now we've created that public variable. We've got our wisp selected, and here we can use the picker to go and find that cricket sound and assign it to that variable. The other thing we need to do while we're here is actually edit that sound itself and send it to the submix. So new submix send, we're sending it to wisp fire, and again our initial send level is 0. Back in the blueprints we can get a reference to that, drag out, and again set submix send. This time we'll send 0.5 to the submix when we overlap with the wisp, and again we'll switch it off when we end overlap. And we'll remember to assign the correct submix here. So now in the game, we're hearing those crickets with no reverb applied. And then as we overlap with the wisp, you can hear the reverb being applied. Now that's all well and good, but if you've got lots of actors in the area, then this is actually going to be quite laborious. What we can do instead is to send all our sounds to the submix and then control the output volume of the submix itself. Let's go back to our submix and effects folder and create a new submix. Which we'll call Wisp Influence. So this is going to be the submix that changes the sound when we're under the influence of the wisp. In other words, we're within that inner sphere. So let's go back to the crickets and instead send it there to the Wisp Influence submix. And there's another sound in this area that I also would like to affect, and that is the magpies and sedge warblers. So submix sends Wisp Influence. Now this time I'm going to set up my send levels as I'd like them. So 0.75 of the sedge warbler going to that submix and 0.35 of the crickets. But then I'm going to edit the submix itself, and I'm going to set its output volume to 0. So these sounds are going to the submix, but then we'll adjust the submix output volume when the player comes within that sphere of the will-o'-the-wisp. Back in our blueprint, we need to access that submix, so we'll create a variable of type submix. We'll call that wisp influence, and we'll set it to be type submix. Compile that and then assign our wisp influence submix. Now we can set its output volume with set submix output volume. Now we don't want it to suddenly jump, so let's use a timeline and increase the output volume over a few seconds. So we'll play that timeline from the start and we'll create a float track. We'll put our first point at the beginning, and that's going to be time 0, value 0. And then we'll create another point, let's say 1.5 seconds. And here we'll set the output volume of the submix to be 1. And when we leave the sphere of the wisp, what we'll do is we'll reverse that timeline. And particularly because we're going to be reversing this timeline, we need to make sure that the timeline length matches that of the last key, in this case 1.5 seconds. I'm just going to go back to the submix and assign an effect that I've already prepared, and that is a tap delay here, and set the submix output volume initially to 0. So both these sounds are going to that submix and they have their send levels set, but the submix itself has got an output volume of 0 until we enter that area of influence, and then this timeline is going to bring up that output volume to 1. And we can delete this submix send for the crickets since they're now using this system instead. So we'll connect those up. So we should be hearing the magpie and the sedge warbler and the crickets, and they all sound fairly natural. And then we enter that area of influence of the wisp, and we can hear that tap delay in effect. Now we've got reference to this submix, we can do other things. So if we search for submix effects, we can see our options. We can add submix effects, remove or replace submix effects. But like swapping in and out source effects, this is best done while the sound is not actually playing, or else we get sudden changes or artifacts. It's usually better to manipulate the settings of the effects themselves. Now everybody knows that when approached by a will-o'-the-wisp in the forest, the one thing you should never do is to look directly at it, since otherwise it will steal your soul and condemn you to eternal damnation. So let's manipulate the reverb effect, if this condition is true, to indicate that something is changing when you look at the will-o'-the-wisp. We'll create a new variable of type submix effect reverb preset, which, if you remember, is the one that we're using on the wisp sound itself. So submix effect reverb preset, object reference, compile, and we can now select that wisp reverb and manipulate it. So it's the wisp fire reverb we want to play around with. Opening up that reverb, you can see that it's got quite a few settings here, and the one we're interested in is this decay high frequency ratio. This determines how much quicker or slower the high frequencies decay relative to the low frequencies, and its initial setting is 2, so we'll remember that, and we'll go back to our blueprint. We'll come down here because this is where the line trace from the player character is detecting whether we're looking at the wisp sphere or not. We'll get a reference to our reverb here, and we'll get settings, and then we'll break those. And here we can see that decay high frequency. So then, after we've manipulated it, what we want to do is to set settings. And again, this time we're going to make the reverb settings. I'm going to connect all of those up except for the decay high frequency ratio. I want this to change smoothly over time. So again, I'm going to use a timeline and create a float track. Now you might remember that the original setting of that decay high frequency ratio was 2. So let's start with 2 at time 0. And then about 2 seconds in, I want this to come down to a value of 0.1. And I'll set the length of my timeline accordingly. Then I can feed that float track into this decay high frequency ratio here. So when the player looks at the wisp, we're going to play that from start. And when the player is no longer looking at the wisp, we're going to reverse. In fact, this can be a little on-off quite quickly. So I'm going to add a delay in there of maybe 0.4 so we don't get that flicking back and forward quite as much. And then connect the update output of the timeline to the set settings node. So we've got a reference to that reverb, and that could be any effect, and we've got its settings, we've broken them out, we're manipulating one of them in this case, and then applying those new settings. Let's add a print string so we can just see those numbers in action for a minute. And let's try that out. So we are in the sphere of influence of the wisp, within that sphere. So we've got reverb applied, and then when we look directly at it, we're going to hear those reverb settings change. And then we're going to look away. So now we just need to switch that print string off. Set our world to midnight for extra spookiness. And then let's see the final effect. So here we have the will-o'-the-wisp roaming randomly around this wood. And when we come in to that sphere of influence, as indicated by the green mist, then things get a little bit odd. We enter the sound bubble. So the Wisp's fire has some reverb on it. The environment sounds that we're hearing around us suddenly get a bit mysterious with those tap delays. And if we look directly at the Wisp, the reverb becomes kind of more extreme sounding. All very mysterious. In this video, we've looked at a number of ways to control submix effects. Using send levels can sometimes be useful, but often when we have a number of sounds going to a submix, it's more efficient to simply change the output volume of the submix itself. Like the source effects, we're also able to dynamically change the settings of the submix effects, either directly via transforming parameter values into an appropriate range, or through the use of timelines to drive the parameter changes.